Si gustan, podemos empezar por el
Okay, so
tiempo.
let's begin. Try to stay on track. We're going to take advantage of the early morning now that we're all connected, and we will listen to an introduction on Invest, which we're organizing along with the organizations that are up on the screen. The GEO Group on Earth Observations, Simokute, NASA, and it all has to do with the use of Earth observation in our ecosystem. A very important participant is the Prius Lab in Costa Rica that provides technical support for this project, and the Central Bank of Costa Rica, which is also associated to the project given its important relationship with ecosystem services. At a global level, we're working with the Natural Capital Project that's coordinated it's coordinated with Stanford University, and we have the experts from the Woods Institute connected with us today. So this project has been taking place or has occurred with support from GEO and NASA, and also GEOE Amazon Web Services that works with the GEO group with input from GeoBon on the biodiversity side. So that was mentioned yesterday briefly.
Y el proceso
So
ha
we'll learn a
iniciado
bit
en
more about that
2018.
today. So
El
this
país
this has been taking place since 2018.
que se hizo entre la Universidad de Stanford y las
The
autoridades,
country
el ministro de Ambiente, Carlos
began
Rodríguez,
working on this with a contact that our former minister Rodriguez made with Stanford University and President Alvarado did. So in 2018, a commission was established, and we held a first workshop last year where we were introduced to this entire process. Sorry about that, screen. So now we've organized these workshops, the workshops we held yesterday and today. And the idea is to share results, but to develop your skills so that they can be able to apply these products and understand how they're built and maybe how they can apply to our own realities. We'll be holding more dynamic participatory workshops, hands-on workshops in the months starting next year, which is also part of the workshop and which we are going to invite you, of course, so you can learn. Thanks again to everyone who's connected, to our organizers and our speakers. We have 20 participants. That's wonderful. For 20 audience members. That's great. Remember, don't forget to stay on the right channel so that you can listen to the right language. We hope that you will all participate more than you did yesterday. And don't forget to post your questions in the chat box, but we will be able to have more of a longer Q&A session since we have more time. So I'm going to give the floor, to Jesse Goldstein.
Gracias. Thank you, Rafa. Good morning and welcome, everyone. I'm Jesse Goldstein, a GIS analyst with the Natural Capital Project, or NatCap, at Stanford University. And I am excited to start off the second day of our workshop, where we will examine some Invest models in more detail. And I'm even going to give a live demonstration of the Invest user interface. But first, I'm going to provide some background. So before we get into that, we'd like to remind you that a recording of the webinar and our slides that we present today will be available following the event. We ask that you only use the Q&A to submit questions related to NatCap, Invest, or other workshop content. Before submitting your question, you can browse those others have submitted. And if someone already asked the same one, you can give it a thumbs up to bump it up in priority instead of retyping it. The chat box, we're reserving for logistics or technical assistance related to the webinar itself. So as questions come up, please type them in the Q&A, and we're going to answer them when we have breaks between sessions and even on the fly by typing. So please don't hesitate to engage that way, and then we'll answer questions live at the end. Okay, so just a quick refresher on the basics before we get into the models. So you probably all know that NatCap pioneers science, technology, and partnerships that enable people and nature to thrive. We work to integrate the value nature provides to society into all major decisions. Our ultimate objective is to improve the well-being of all people and nature by motivating greater and more targeted natural capital investments. So through cutting-edge ecosystem services science, we map, measure, and value nature's benefits to people. Through innovative technology, like our Invest software platform, we harness global environmental data to provide decision makers with actionable information for policy, finance, and management decisions. And through our partnerships, we produce tailored results informed by local knowledge. We innovate and build capacity with communities worldwide, engage key leaders, and collaborate to reform institutions so that private short-term goals more closely align with society's long-term goals. We know that when managed properly, ecosystems yield a flow of services that are vital to humanity, including the production of goods like food, life support processes such as water purification, life-fulfilling conditions like aesthetics and opportunities for recreation, and the conservation of options for the future, such as through genetic diversity. Through NatCap's approach, Invest can enable decision makers to assess quantified trade-offs associated with alternative management choices and to identify areas where investment in natural capital can enhance human development and conservation. By recognizing that changes in ecosystems cause changes in the services they provide, we can evaluate differences between scenarios. The modular design of Invest supports inclusion of multi-service assessments, providing an effective tool for balancing the environmental and economic goals of diverse entities who manage natural resources for multiple uses. The toolset includes distinct ecosystem service models designed for different ecosystem types, as well as a number of helper tools to assist with locating and processing input data, and also for understanding and visualizing outputs. So this diagram depicts the steps in an ecosystem services process and a generalization of the NatCap approach. Of course, there is much more to it than simply running models. In fact, we spend much more of our time scoping projects and compiling and preparing data layers. Okay, so Invest is NatCap's flagship software product, and it stands for Integrated Valuation of Ecosystem Services and Trade-offs. Invest is a suite of free open source software models used to map and value the goods and services from nature that sustain and fulfill human life. Yesterday, we introduced proposed improvements to the Invest software suite that we were calling Invest Plus. But today, I'm going to be covering the current versions of Invest models that are in production and available for all to download from the NatCap website. So these models represent the baselines without the additional Earth observation inputs and tweaks that Rafa, Ale, and Jeff covered yesterday. Invest uses a simple framework delineating supply, service, and value. Supply represents what is potentially available from the ecosystem. For example, supply can be the wave attenuation provided by a particular location's density of mangrove forest that our coastal vulnerability model might analyze, as an example. Service is where we first apply the human dimension in that it incorporates demand, such as the demand for reduced coastal erosion and flooding. Thus, we need to use information about beneficiaries of that service. For instance, where people live, locations of important cultural sites, infrastructure, etc. And value includes social preference and allows for the calculation of economic and social metrics like number of people affected or avoided damages from erosion and flooding. Invest's simple models have relatively simple data requirements, and they are spatially explicit, using maps as information sources and producing maps as outputs. Invest returns results in either biophysical terms, for example, tons of carbon sequestered, or economic terms like the net present value of that sequestered carbon. And I'm going to show you examples of these inputs and outputs. The models are applicable across the globe, and the spatial resolution of analyses is flexible. So you can use this to address questions at local, regional, national, or global scales. Knowing how to use geographic information system software, such as QGIS or ArcGIS, is crucial for preparing spatial inputs to invest models and for viewing and understanding model output and post-processing the output to provide meaningful results. But running the invest models themselves does not require a GIS. Each of the tools stands as an independent application. So here you can see a representation of the wide variety of models we've developed and deployed. On the left, you might notice that Invest is not NatCap's only software application, but again, it is our centerpiece. So I will show you how to use the Invest dashboard or user interface shortly. But first, allow me to explain the basics of how it works. So we'll input spatial data layers such as land use cover, biophysical data such as climate variables or evapotranspiration, and socioeconomic data like population density or other demographics. Invest's algorithms then calculate the benefits provided by the services you are analyzing and provide results as maps. With this spatial approach, users can compare different scenarios to investigate what will change under different management strategies or future conditions, like climate change, by varying the inputs. Okay, so let's get into our first model. We're going to cover the sediment delivery ratio, or SDR. So here's a slide Rafa showed us yesterday, reminding us that erosion is, of course, a natural process driven by topography, climate, and vegetation. But unsustainable land management practices increase erosion rates, which leads to negative consequences on food and water systems. The SDR model deals with sediment transport to streams and how ecosystems impact those sediment loads. So some decision contexts where the SDR model has been useful include payments for watershed services programs, assessments of the impact of sediment loads on infrastructure, accounting for retention services of vegetation, preventing sediment from entering streams on national scales, and evaluation of global land use change, like the impact of agricultural expansion on sediment loads. The services that this model can help analyze are health and well-being of downstream beneficiaries, the avoided costs of water treatment, or perhaps greater economic provision of hydropower production in an economic setting, and stream health, or biological integrity, as sediment is detrimental to most organisms that live in streams. In the supply service value framework, this model helps to capture the biophysical supply of sediment retention performed by natural landscapes. The service of water purification is represented by the use of that clean water by people. There are various ways of valuing that water purification service. The model helps to understand the spatial patterns of sediment sources and transport to assess the service provided by natural landscapes in keeping that sediment out of streams. The model runs in two main steps. The first computes erosion loss from each pixel based on the universal soil loss equation, or USLE. In the second step, the model computes the sediment delivery ratio, which tells us how much sediment enters streams. This is where we get to sediment export or delivery. So SDR assesses the ability of the landscape to keep sediment out of streams. Let's talk through each of these steps. The model estimates annual erosion and delivery of that eroded sediment to streams according to abiotic and vegetation-related characteristics of the landscape and their spatial arrangement. So the model works by first predicting potential soil loss from each pixel using the USLE, which is a product of 5 factors, each of which is considered per parcel or per pixel. So first we have slope, and then there is erosivity, which is commonly derived from average annual rainfall and its erosive power. Soil erodibility, or how easily soil can be eroded, and then 2 vegetation factors, the conservation factor, which we've termed P, and the crop factor, C. These describe the supply of sediment retention, preventing erosion on a pixel. So USLE predicts annual erosion in tons per pixel and is the product of these 5 factors. To remind you about the crop factor, C, here again is Rafa's slide from yesterday. The left side shows some input layers. For the land cover map, each land cover class is associated with the C factor. And I'll show you this in action shortly. The better a class or a land cover type retains sediment, the lower its C factor. So forest has a low C factor shown in green pixels in the grid on the right, and will retain more sediment than will pasture, which has a high C factor shown in the tan color, and will therefore experience greater soil loss than will forest. USLE is a very well-established and popular method that's been around for a long time. So that's great when searching for data for parameterizing your model, because it is relatively easy to find studies that have used the USLE in most regions of the world. But some of the limitations are that it only models overland erosion, as in sheet wash or rill coming off slopes. It does not capture erosion from gullies, channels, or landslides. So it only considers on-slope deposition. It does not consider reservoir sedimentation, floodplain, or in-stream deposition. There's also high uncertainty in parameters with very high slopes, as in the model is not ideal for extremely steep terrain or mountainous areas. And the C and P factors can be difficult to parameterize precisely, but in the spirit of INVEST, SDR is a relatively simple and straightforward model. So remember, SDR is concerned with sediment loads in streams, not simply erosion rates. So we need to figure out how much of the soil that is eroded from a pixel actually makes it all the way to a stream. This can be thought of as a fraction or a ratio, and it describes the fraction of soil coming off a given pixel that is exported to a stream. This is the sediment delivery ratio. Okay, so from this, we get an idea of sediment loads in streams and places on the landscape that are not just experiencing erosion, but are really contributing to in-stream sedimentation. As an illustration of how the delivery ratio is calculated, we'll look at this orange pixel. After calculating USLE on that pixel, we look at two topographical attributes in order to arrive at SDR. First is the upslope area in relation to transport. So this is the area on the landscape that drains into the orange pixel. You can think of this as contributing energy to carry erosion from that pixel into the stream. So if that area is very large or steep or does not have substantial vegetative cover to slow the energy of water, then it will carry a lot of soil eroded from the orange pixel all the way to the stream. The second consideration is retention by the downslope path after sediment leaves the orange pixel. The shorter, steeper, or sparser the coverage of sediment retaining vegetation in this path is, the more sediment from our pixel that will be delivered to the stream. So these two landscape variables are used to calculate the delivery ratio for our pixel. The sediment export is the product of that ratio and USLE. Total annual sediment export from the area of interest is simply the sum of each pixel's value. An important thing to keep in mind is that once sediment is modeled to reach a stream, it is considered exported. The model does not include any representation of in-stream deposition. So one implication of this is that where the model thinks the streams are strongly impacts how much export it predicts. Once the sediment loads associated with a given land cover scenario are calculated, it's possible to think about performing valuation. For example, you could use an avoided costs approach. However, we strongly recommend being very cautious when attempting valuation. To do it well, you really want to be sure to calibrate the model as precisely as possible by conducting a detailed economic analysis using high quality local data, and to make sure that your valuation is appropriate given the context of the place where you are working. Okay, so we're going to look at the model inputs first here and then in a GIS. So the model inputs are the landscape descriptors or components of USLE and topography, which enable the upslope contributing area and downslope retention path to be calculated. We need rainfall erosivity, which can be derived from annual climate. We need soil erodibility available from global databases. We need a land use land cover raster associated with those P and C factors. And we need a digital elevation model, or DEM, which allows the model to calculate slope and identify streams. A watershed polygon layer is also a required input, and it's important that this model be run for a complete watershed or a hydrologically complete area, because we need to be able to calculate the upslope contributing area for each pixel. So be careful that your layers are not cut off at political boundaries that are meaningless to watersheds and gravity. And for your first run, we recommend sticking with the model's default calibration parameters. Another important input is the threshold flow accumulation value, or TFA. This helps the model to create streams by routing flow across the landscape. So the threshold flow accumulation is the number of pixels necessary to flow into a given pixel before it is considered a stream. This is important because once sediment reaches a stream, it's considered exported. So with a high TFA value, you have a coarse stream network because sediment must travel a long way over the landscape to reach a stream. With a lower TFA, your stream network will be finer and there is less chance for the landscape to retain sediment. Because this is expressed in the number of pixels, it depends on the resolution of your DEM. The correct way to estimate your TFA is by playing with different values and then checking streams generated by the model against a real perennial stream network. Okay, let's look at the layers in a GIS and practice running the model. So here I am in ArcGIS, and here is my first input, which is my watersheds layer for Costa Rica. And I'm just going to turn this off so it doesn't take too long to draw. Our next input is our DEM, our elevation model, shown here with red being the highest elevations and green the lowest. We also need an erodibility layer. So this is about the soil. The darker areas represent the most erodible soils, and the lightest areas, the least easily eroded. And then similarly, we have erosivity, which is the erosive power of the precipitation. And one really important one I accidentally skipped here is land use cover. So here's our land cover map. You can see green. I don't know if you can see the panel on the left, but green is forest. Orange and yellow are savanna and agriculture. And gray is urban area, buildings and concrete. Okay, so really keep this in mind a bit, and we'll toggle back and forth. One last input I need to show you is our biophysical table. So this is associated with the land cover map. And for each land use code in the land cover map, shown in the highlighted column on the left, we have a corresponding C, or crop factor. And you'll notice that these forest classes have a much lower C factor than do these classes here, which are our savanna and agricultural classes. So this is on a scale of 0 to 1, and these classes here are the most common in Costa Rica, as we'll see at the map again in a moment. But this is orders of magnitude higher C factor than with the forest class. So I would expect a lot more export happening here than in the forests. So let's check out our results. First, we have export. And you can see the darker areas are indicating more export. And that does seem to align with these orange classes in the land cover map, where we have more export, and I skipped ahead a little bit. I'm sorry. As I explained the model, we actually first look at soil loss, right? So that's universal soil loss. And it's going to look kind of a similar pattern. But again, there's more soil loss happening in the darker red in the savannas and agricultural areas than in the forests, and also more happening in the mountainous areas where the colors are transitioning over the shortest distance from red to green. It's steepest. So we'd expect to see more soil loss there. And then similarly, export, how much of that eroded soil actually arrives at the stream, shows a very similar pattern. We can also look at retention. So this is more of a map of the service providing by the landscape. And I would expect this to align more with higher values, the darker greens corresponding more with the forests that provide those retention services. Another thing we can look at is we get results from our watershed table. And this is going to have a result for every basin that we entered, but the models added new columns for us. So we have a column for each watershed that tells us in tons annually the universal soil loss from that basin. We have a column for sediment export, a column for sediment retention, and there's even a sediment deposition column. So that's a quick run through of what some of the input and output layers look like in a GIS. And the other thing I forgot to show you is how to run the model. So if you've installed Invest from our, downloaded and installed from our website and you're on Windows, it will show up in your start menu on the bottom left, and you'll scroll to Invest, click the folder, and you'll see all the many models we have. And so in this case, we're doing SDR. And I already have it open here. It looks like this. This is the interface. So these, you want to get all these red X's green before you can run the model. So the first thing we need to do is choose where we want our outputs to go. So if I browse, I've created a folder on my desktop called SDR output, and I'm going to select that. Then you can see it turn green. It's always a good idea to give a suffix in case you have multiple runs in the same folder. So I'm going to call this CR workshop, and I like to give the date. Okay. Now, instead of browsing through each layer, we can actually just drag the layers from our file explorer on Windows into Invest. So here I am in my C drive. This is just my local hard drive. And you'll notice that I have a folder called Invest with the version number I've installed. It's separate from my other program files folders. So if I go in there, if you've chosen to install the sample data, you'll see the sample data folder. And in there, we have sample data for each of our models. So we're doing SDR, and here's my sample input data. So I need a DEM, and this tells me it's a raster. If I want more information, these blue icons, you can click and they give you some details. So I'm going to grab my DEM. I'm going to make sure I have the .tif extension, drag it in, and the dashboard tells me it's good. Next, I need an erosivity layer. Here's that. I need erodibility. Of course, we need our land use cover, super important. I want to, again, make sure to grab the .tif, which is the raster. Next, we need watersheds, which is a vector. So I'm looking for my shapefile, .shp.
Jesse,
Yeah.
colleague is saying if you can amplify the resolution so he can see better.
Yeah, I really apologize. Thank you, Rafa, that this is so small. I was trying to play with my Windows settings to make the text larger, and I couldn't quite figure that out. I can do this, but it's probably not going to help. The basic idea here is that you're reading this and you're making sure you're grabbing the right file from your folder and dragging it in and looking for those green checks. So maybe we can talk about this later if someone else has a better idea, but yeah, I apologize that it's not more visible. I'll try to get through this not too much longer then. So next we need a biophysical table, which is in the form of a CSV. And I'm going to enter my threshold flow accumulation, which will just choose the default value of 1,000. And then these last parameters, I'm just going to go with the default parameters that we recommend, and I'll show you are available in the user guide. And unless you know more about the area, we'd say stick with these. So that's it. Everything is checked green. And then all you have to do is click run, and you'll get a screen like this. Now this would take a little while, so I'm not going to wait for it to fully run. I'm using the sample data instead of our Costa Rica data because that would take much longer. So I'll go back to the presentation and we'll just check on this in a little bit. Okay. So we are going, before we move on to the next model, it's important that I remind you about some resources. So the Invest user guide is an invaluable resource for learning not only about the science and theory behind each model, but also how to use it. You can access the guide on our website where we have English and Spanish versions. So this is not just for SDR. There's a detailed chapter on each model. There are references and links to global data sources and details of the math behind each one. We really recommend reading the user guide carefully before using any invest model, and then use it as your first resource for answering questions. Also, if you have more questions it doesn't answer or want to look for other suggestions on data sources from users, check out our community forum. That's at community.naturalcapitalproject.org. It is a natural capital community and support site that we monitor regularly. There you can also search for information, post new questions, and connect with ecosystem service practitioners around the world. So for instance, if you get some error message, the forums are the place to search, and chances are someone already addressed your same issue. Okay, we're gonna move on, but let's just see if my model finished. For some reason, I'm having trouble accessing Invest at the moment. Oh, here we go. So that's it. When it runs, you want to see this green bar, model completed successfully, and then you'd expect your results to be in the output folder you chose, which mine was on my desktop. And there's all my outputs that the model just created: export, retention, USLE, rasters, and my new updated watershed results. So I'm not going to spend as much time with each of these other models because Invest kind of builds on itself. And once you've seen one model, you can kind of get a sense of how the others work. So I'm not going to show you everything in a GIS again, but I'll still try to show you screenshots of inputs and outputs. Okay, crop pollination. This model focuses on cross-pollination performed by bees. So we know that pollination is crucial for natural systems. Pollinators facilitate flowering plant fertilization and reproduction. Many animal species depend on these plants as food sources, as does our economy for fruit and seed crops that are key commodities, like coffee. 75% of globally important crops depend on animal pollination. Pollination increases crop yield, quality, and stability, contributing to food security and nutrition. Some studies have estimated the value of this service to be in the tens of billions of US dollars. The picture on the left here is from a study showing strawberries that were cross-pollinated by insects, and on the right, berries from a group that was only allowed to self and wind pollinate. The model deals only with native bees and feral honeybees, not managed captive bees. This is because wild bees provide ecosystem services from natural systems. Besides European honeybees, 20,000 other kinds of bees pollinate plants. So supply for this model is the pollinator abundance across the landscape. Service is the crop pollination, and value is the value of the crop yield that is attributable to wild pollinators. So we know, like all animals, bees need food, and they need food in the form of pollen and nectar, which they get from flowering plants. But they also need places to build nests, like tree cavities and holes in the ground. The model uses information about the availability of nesting sites, flower supply, and flight ranges to give a relative abundance of pollinators across the whole landscape, the abundance visiting farms, and the value of their farm visitation. The types of questions the tool is intended to answer are: how much do wild pollinators contribute to crop yield? Secondly, where are pollinator habitats important for crop yield? And how would services change under different scenarios. The model requires a land cover map as an input, just like SDR does. For each land cover class, information on nesting sites and flower availability are required, which can be acquired from field estimates or expert opinion. The nesting availability index runs from 0 to 1, representing the availability of a nesting type in that land use class. So you'd give a 1 to a class with greater abundance of that cover and make all the other indices relative to that. The floral resources index represents the abundance of flowers in that class for that season. So I'll show you examples. So using these data, the model first estimates pollinator supply for every cell in the landscape based on the available nesting sites in that cell, the floral resources or food in surrounding cells, and the relative abundance of that pollinator species. Floral resources in cells near nesting sites are given more weight than distant cells, according to the species' average foraging range. This seems intuitive and is confirmed by a survey of 23 case studies, which found a general trend of decline in pollination services with increasing isolation or distance from natural habitat. Pollinator supply is an indicator of where pollinators originate from on the landscape. Pollinator abundance indicates where pollinators are active on the landscape. Abundance depends on the floral resources that attract pollinators to a cell and the supply of pollinators that can access that cell. Next, using the indices of pollinator abundance across the landscape, the location on farms, and information about each farm, the model can calculate an index of total yield attained and the contribution of wild pollinators to that yield. For valuation, the model assumes that crop yields increase as pollinator visitation increases, but with diminishing returns. The value output is a relative index and is not expressed in any absolute monetary units. So let's look more closely at the model inputs. We have our land cover map, and we will also need a shapefile with the location of farms, shown here as small blue hexagons on the map. These are not the locations of real farms because those polygons would be too small to see at this scale. This is just an example. Next, we input a biophysical table that is associated with the land cover raster. So here is Jeff's. So just like with SDR, we have a column for the class codes that matches up with the raster. That's on the far left. This is the Then we have a nesting availability index values. So that is the relative index of the availability of the given nesting type within each class on a scale from 0 to 1. The substrate name must exactly match a substrate name given in the guild table, which we'll see next. So I put a red box around those substrate names at the top of the columns here. The floral resources index column provides a relative abundance of flowers in each class for the given season. So there are two aspects to consider when estimating relative floral abundance for each class: percent floral abundance or coverage, as well as the duration of flowering during each season. For example, a land cover type with a crop that flowers the entire season with an abundance cover of 80% would be given a suitability value of 0.8. A land cover type that flowers only half of the season at 80% floral coverage would be given a floral suitability value of 0.4. So the season name shown in the blue box here in the top right must exactly match the name given in the guild table. Here's Jeff's guild table. The first column gives names of species or guilds. These can be numerical codes or strings or whatever you want to call them. Next, there are nesting suitability index columns for each substrate defined. Values run from 0 to 1, with 1 indicating a nesting substrate that is fully utilized, and 0 indicating a substrate that is not utilized at all. Substrates are user defined. The substrate string must exactly match the nesting availability name from the biophysical table. We also need a foraging activity index column for each season defined. This gives pollinator activity by floral season. So 1 indicates the season of greatest activity for each guild or species, and 0 indicates a season of no activity. Seasons are user defined, but might include wet and dry, or spring, summer, fall, and winter. The season string must match a floral resource season index column from the biophysical table. Next, we have an alpha column. This gives an average distance over each species or guild travels, the average distance each species travels to forage on flowers, and it's specified in meters. So the model uses this estimated distance to define the neighborhood of available flowers around a given cell, and to weight the sums of floral resources and pollinator abundances on farms. This value can be determined by the typical foraging distance of a bee species based on an allometric relationship. Lastly, the column on the right, relative abundance, has values indicating the weighted relative abundance of the species contribution to pollinator abundance. So the model can produce 3 types of outputs. Pollinator abundance over landscape is an index of the likely abundance of pollinator species nesting on each cell in the landscape, given the availability of nesting sites in that cell and of nearby flower resources, summed over all species. Jeff's abundance raster is shown here. This represents the potential sources of pollinators. The model outputs one of these for each season you ask for. But remember, if there is no demand, then there is no service provided. Second, pollinator abundance on farms tells us the pollinator abundance on each agricultural cell in the landscape, based on the average of all bee species or guilds. It represents the likely average abundance of pollinators visiting each farm site based on their foraging distance. This represents the relative amount of service provided to the demand points, which are agricultural cells. Finally, pollinator service value is a map showing where pollination services are coming from and their relative values. This is the relative value of the pollinator supply in each agricultural cell to crop production in the surrounding neighborhood. Again, units are not dollars, but instead, this is an index of relative economic value. Here's a look at Jeff's farm abundance shapefile result. For each farm, we get a column of average pollinator abundance for the active season, a total yield index, which includes wild and managed pollinators and pollinator independent yield, an index of potential pollination dependent yield that's attributable to wild pollinators, and an index of the total yield attributable to wild pollinators. Okay, here's our last model. And we're gonna have, again, please enter your questions, and we're gonna take questions in a few minutes. So this one's gonna go the quickest because you all are understanding Invest so much more now. So recreation and tourism. We know they're important components of many national and local economies, and they contribute in innumerable ways to quality of life, sense of place, social connection, physical well-being, learning, and other intangibles. So focusing on nature-based tourism, the supply of natural capital might be an ecological trait like biodiversity or habitat that supports endemism or target species for birders. Service can be thought of as an opportunity for ecotourism or the ecotourism itself. And value can be revenue or jobs in the local community generated by that tourism. The Invest, Recreation, and Tourism model is designed to answer 3 basic questions. 1, what are the relative vegetation rates across a landscape or across a set of sites? 2, which features influence the spatial pattern of visitation rates, and what are the relative levels of influence of those features? And third, given a new scenario where the spatial patterns of the natural or built features have changed, how will the visitation rates change in response? To quantify the value of natural and built environments, the model predicts the spread of person days of recreation based on the locations of natural habitats and other features, such as amenities or travel time, that factor into people's decisions about where to recreate. The tool estimates the contribution of each attribute to vegetation rate in a simple linear regression. Of course, which predictors to use is totally dependent on the context. So a trait like water clarity is super important to scuba diving tourists, but it might be meaningless to other groups. We find that it often helps to consider at least one predictor variable from several categories. So for example, a natural consideration such as habitats, a built feature like hotels, and an access or cost attribute, maybe distance to a major airport. Often single variables representing each of these categories can explain the majority of variation in visitation. This tool allows users to provide predictor variables as raster or vector data and to process those layers in a variety of ways. Since fine scale data on the numbers of visitors is often only collected at a few specific locations in any study region, we assume that current visitation can be approximated by the total number of annual person days of photographs uploaded to the photo sharing website Flickr. Many of the photographs on Flickr have been assigned to a specific location given in latitude, longitude coordinates. Using this location, along with the photographer's username and date that the image was taken, the Invest model counts the total photo user days for each grid cell or polygon. One photo user day at a location equals one unique photographer who took at least one photo on a specific day. For each cell, the model sums the number of photo user days for all days within a user-defined range of years and returns the average annual number of photo user days. The tool estimates the magnitude of each predictor's effect based on its spatial correspondence with current visitation in the area of interest. The values of photo person days per cell are taken as a measure of visitation and are regressed against the values of the predictor variables across all cells. So we feel good about this approach because we have observed that the number of recreators who visit a location annually is related to the number of photographs taken in the same area and uploaded to the Flickr database at 836 visitor attractions worldwide. Because of the reliance on Flickr data, you do need an internet connection to run this model, unlike the other invest models. So let's take a look at some of Ale's results from the work she presented yesterday. This is a map of predicted tourism based on Flickr photos. The green areas represent the most visitation. And regressing her visitation proxy, the number of Flickr photos per pixel against species or taxa richness, Ale observed positive correlations across all 4 terrestrial vertebrate classes. Finally, you can vary the locations and values of the different predictors that you feed the model to assess how those changes in built features or ecosystems would affect changes in services. Okay, always remember to reference the Invest user guide. We have English and Spanish versions on our website. We recommend reading the guide carefully before using any Invest model. Also, please check out our community forum at community.naturalcapitalproject.org. It's a natural capital community and support site monitored by our engineers and scientists, where you can search for new information, post questions, and connect with practitioners around the world. Please take NatCap's massive open online course, or MOOC. It's available at edx.org. That's edx.org. It's free and it's newly released in Spanish. So please head on over there. We think you'll get a lot out of it. The course introduces a NatCap's approach to using ecosystem service information to inform decisions. It uses specific examples to illustrate how the approach has worked in each case and highlights key methods and tools used in implementation. On our website, you'll also be able to sign up for our newsletter, find our publications, explore where we work, and continue to learn about how NatCap's approach is used in diverse applications around the world. The URL for downloading the Invest installer and associated sample data is naturalcapitalproject.stanford.edu/invest. There is also a parameter database on that page that you can download to help parameterize your models. So just a reminder, we will be posting the recording of this workshop and our slides for you to view later. Look for that on Cinea's Facebook page and on NatCap's website or YouTube channel. On our website, you can also view full recordings and access slide decks from the Invest virtual workshops we conducted this summer. There's a ton of great information in there. Please do visit NatCap's data visualization gallery at viz.naturalcapitalproject.stanford.edu. That's viz.naturalcapitalproject.stanford.edu. There you can navigate through examples of interactive viewers and dashboards and find resources to facilitate synthesizing, visualizing, and communicating data. Please do follow us on social media. Our Twitter handle is @NatCapProject. We plan to host more events like this, so please stay tuned for more workshops to come and ask Rafa for the details. We're going to take some questions here in a moment, so please remember, use the Q&A to submit questions related to NatCap, ecosystem services, Invest, or other content. If someone already asked your question, just give it a thumbs up so you don't have to retype it. The chat is meant for webinar issues or logistics. So muchas gracias a todos, and let's please take questions now.
And Jesse, did you say that they can raise their hand? I'm not sure if I heard.
I think I forgot that. Please.
Okay, maybe we should, if you would prefer, we can unmute you. If you, let me make sure that I actually know how to do that before I say that. Yeah, so if you just raise your hand, I can unmute you. It's easier to converse that way.
Becky, también estamos recibiendo preguntas en el chat. Veo que están respondiendo, por eso desaparecen.
We're also
Entonces,
getting questions in the chat, and
Okay.
they're being answered, so that's why they're disappearing. Like there's a question from the tourism ministry and one on the course that Jesse mentioned.
Okay.
So where they could get more information about the data used for these models if they're available at SNIG and SNIG. And there's information available there, and there's more information that we had to obtain and other information with international data. That was part of the project to be able to come up with data. Becky, maybe you can elaborate. You can elaborate on the data that we need to run the models. Or Desi, sorry. Becky or Desi.
On the tourism model specifically?
no sé, es una pregunta de David Solís.
It's David Solis's question. Maybe we should ask him. I'm just reading the question. Where do we get the necessary data to run the models? That's what the question says.
Oh, well, I guess maybe, yeah, that we could have done that model by model as well, Jesse, but it really depends on the data source, for sure. Jesse, maybe do you want to bring up a slide with some of the inputs and we could talk through some of those? For example, the sediment retention model.
Yeah, do you want me to like pull up the GIS maybe?
Oh, sure. Yeah, that works too. But just so we can step through, or the slide that's summarizing, maybe that's the best one, the slide that summarizes what all the inputs are. Sorry. Yeah, something like that. Okay, so, and maybe also Rafael Schmidt, if you want to join us in the panel here, you can add more. But in general, really, a lot of these are global data sets that are maintained by, for instance, water or hydro sheds. Is that WWF? I'm trying to remember who maintains that, Rafa.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay.
So all freely available, different resolutions as a function of which scale you're working on. And the like capacity of your computer, you want to use data of different resolution probably, and like hydrosheds provides a very convenient way of getting to these data at like 90 or 200 or 1 kilometer resolution.
So there's climate data sets that are global that are maintained by WorldClim at 1 kilometer. You can do conversions from precipitation to erosivity based on the amount of rain events in a month, or there are some global erosivity data sets. Oh yeah, that's a good idea, Jesse.
Yeah,
so in the user guide, there's actually suggested sources for a lot of different data sets for every model.
Yeah, this is our chapter for the SDR model in the user guide, and there's so much information in here. And when you have questions, go here first. If you look in the appendix of data sources, and there's links to these data sources. So most of these are global data sources, and they're going to explain a lot about them with references and everything. So definitely look at the user guide. Of course, when you want to, customize your model to where you're working, that's where we work with local partners and really try to get information on the ground to refine some of our parameters and make the data as local and pertinent to our study area as possible. But if you don't know where to start, look at the user guide, and you can also check the forum. No.
Yes, Rafa Monge. Did you have another point?
Gracias. Para esto de los datos, es importante también tomar en cuenta que
For data, it's also important to remember that we will be making part of the outputs available. Now that we're going to hear Kelly on inputs that were developed within the framework of this project for the models, and that we can also use and will be made available on Cinia. I will try to make that easier to understand and more accessible to you, and that's what we're trying to do. That's what this workshop is for also. I don't know if there's
Yeah,
anything to add.
Rafa, that is something actually maybe worth talking about even with this group, because as I was going through looking at what we have already posted on Cinia, it's a huge list of things, and it's not clear which are related to which, just because they're all just listed on the same big server. And so I don't know, like I'd love to hear from people what would be most useful as a way of navigating that, whether we provide some sort of a metadata document that maybe says for the SDR model, here are the inputs and these are the links to those inputs for Costa Rica. Or if there's a way to group the data sets on Cinia. But definitely right now, there's a lot of stuff and it might be a little challenging to find exactly what it is you need. And so maybe this is a group that could brainstorm about that. And if indeed it's useful, or if you could imagine using these kinds of data in your work, which we also want to hear about a little later on in this session.
Gracias, Becky. No sé si la pregunta era para mí o me gustaría también. Bueno,
Not sure if that question was for me or for everyone. Well, okay. Sarah
No.
said if they're going to be. Oh,
sorry, I didn't mean to say we had to answer it right now. I wanted to pose it for us to discuss at the end. We'll hear from Kelly, and then I'll talk briefly about data products. And then I think it would be great to get into that in discussion, how these might be most useful, and especially from an accessibility or discoverability perspective.
So in the interest of time, I think we better move on to Kelly.
Were there
I do
any
see
other questions that we didn't get to that it looks like people have mostly answered them? I just wanted to see if there was.
there is
do you have
one
thoughts
more in the chat
on developing models on other themes? Is that what that? Sorry, my Spanish is bad. Is the question maybe, Sarah, if I unmute you, do you want to say just a little bit more? Do you mean of the list that Jesse showed of all the models that are in the Invest toolkit? Are you interested in just knowing more about the ones that we haven't presented on? Is that what you're asking? Because that's the sort of thing we could get into in an Invest training later in the year or next year. So I'm going to allow you to talk, Sarah, if you would like to unmute yourself. And is she still there? Oh, it doesn't work. Okay, no problem. Sorry. No, I'm sorry to put you on the spot. But if that's a question about more a question of these sets, is there a way for you to learn more about this set of ecosystem services? The answer is yes, and that's, we could do trainings on anything, not just the models that we have presented on so far. If the question's about how do we think about developing new models For instance, you might notice that flood mitigation is missing from this list, which is an interest of a lot of people. That's an area of active development that Rafa is working on right now. And so we are developing new models all the time. So that's something else that's interesting to hear from users, what the highest demand for different types of models. Oh, in different contexts. Okay. Yes, so I'm glad you talked about urban.
Urban development models. New models, for example, in urban development models.
Yeah, so we do have an entire new set of models that we haven't even touched on, a new suite called Urban Invest, which includes a heat island model, a stormwater retention model, different ways of utilizing the tourism, or in this case, we call it the recreation model, that is linked to different components of physical and mental health. Rafa, do you have any others that you can think of off the top of your head? There's a set of 4 or 5, and that's another resource that we could point you to. Those models are just starting to come online. Thank you. And I see that Lori posted that in the chat. So apologies that we didn't even present on a whole other dimension of really active development at NatCap. This team doesn't work on those models specifically, but we can connect to the people that do.
Becky, we're also getting another question in the Q&A about a model that we might develop. Christian asks if it's possible to develop a model of crop production.
Good question, Christian. That has been plaguing us for a while. We do have a crop model that it's basically based on statistics of past crop yields and developing a relationship between climate and between growing degree days and precipitation for different amounts of fertilizer and irrigation use. So that is in the Invest toolkit. It's not as sophisticated as you might want if you were really trying to model crops specifically, if you were looking at a process-based model like DSAT or EPIC. But it's simple, it's pretty straightforward to use, and it gives a good sort of baseline to compare opportunity cost or just understanding the trade-offs between crop production and other ecosystem services.
And we got one more model question in the chat, which is from Alexandro Campo, who asks if we've developed a model for vulnerable species.
Yeah, well, I wonder if Jeff could talk a little bit about the biodiversity modeling in general. But what we have in the Invest toolkit it's one of the oldest models, and I think in general we don't push it because I think there are better ways of doing this, but it's a habitat quality model that does look at, for specific species, what are the threats that it might be facing, and spatially, how do the proximity of those threats affect the quality of habitat for species of interest. But I think Jeff has actually been working a lot on trying to develop a more general biodiversity model for Invest. And again, we're not quite there yet, but this is another area of active development. Jeff, if you wanted to say a few words about that.
Yeah, there are models that are available in Invest, such as the habitat quality model, which if you have a lot of data for a given species, so say in Costa Rica, if you have a lot of data for jaguars, it might be something that you are able to do if you have done lots of field work and studies specifically for that species. Unfortunately, we don't have a general model that we feel comfortable with for sort of species that we don't have as much data for. There are some really great biodiversity models out there that are a little bit more focused on those types of things. So the one that comes to mind right away is GloBio, or the Red List Index for vulnerable species. And it's something we're hoping to integrate more into INVEST, but it's currently more focused on natural capital and ecosystem services than those biodiversity specific models. But great point, and something we're hoping to do soon.
And thank you, Lori, for posting those links in the chat. That's really helpful. Great. Well, we can come back to a lot of, oh, hang on. I'm seeing another one that's very interesting. Other ways to use the models in social research and public policy. If you don't mind, I'd love to hold that until after Kelly's talk, because I think one really powerful demonstration of that, the way that we use these models in decisions, is to look at a scenario exercise, which is what Kelly is going to present on now. So if your internet is stable, Kelly,
I think it is. I think it's stable. Becky, did we want to give people a short break before my presentation? It's been about an hour and 15 minutes.
That's a good idea. Thank you, Kelly. How would people like maybe 3 to 5 minutes? Is that just to be able to get up, stretch? We can put some music on, and we'll come back for Kelly's. Oh, I'm sorry, David had raised his hand and I didn't unmute him. I'm really sorry about that, but we will do it when we come back. So please, yeah, take a stretch break. You can, yeah, run to get a drink or use the facility.
How long?
5 minutes. Let's say 5 minutes. Back at 9:23, or sorry, 10:23. Jesse, give us some music.
Can you hear it?
Yeah, thank you.
teach you what's right from wrong. Say yo now. Lord, oh yeah. Some are still
Thanks, Jesse. Welcome back, everyone. And now we'll hear from Kelly about applying some of these tools in a scenarios context.
Thank you, Becky. As Becky mentioned earlier, I sometimes have problems with my internet, so if worst comes to worst, my colleague Jeff Smith will take over for me partway through the presentation.
I'm sorry, Kelly?
Yeah.
Kelly, sorry to interrupt. I'm so sorry. I can't hear you well. Can you put your
Oh,
microphone
dear.
closer to your, you might have to hold it like Rafa did
Okay.
yesterday. Hold
Can
it to
you
your
hear
mouth.
me a bit
like,
better
closer.
now?
Yes, yes.
Okay,
Oh, much
great.
better. Oh,
Okay,
excellent.
fantastic. I will speak like this and you will be able to hear me. Okay, great. Hello, everyone. Buenos dias, todos y todas. My name is Kelly Langhans, and I am a PhD student at Stanford University. Today, I wanted to share a project I have worked on with the Natural Capital Project, modeling ecosystem services across Costa Rica and how they could change with riparian reforestation. So many policymakers are interested in ecosystem restoration. However, when we have limited resources, it is important to make sure that we are optimizing where we restore based on the outcomes we hope to achieve. Riparian corridors can be key places to restore. They provide many essential ecosystem services, including clean water, carbon sequestration, habitat, biodiversity for ecotourism, and diverse cultural services. In addition, they provide disproportionately high levels of services compared to the surrounding landscapes. This is because they lie at the interface between aquatic and terrestrial ecosystems, have unique microclimates, and provide landscape connectivity. All of these factors combine to make them important habitat for biodiversity and a nexus for water-related ecosystem services. Costa Rica already has a law in place that protects these important buffers around rivers. The Ley Forestal 7575 of 1996 states that 10 meters of forest must be protected on both sides of rivers in flat urban areas, 15 meters in flat rural areas, and 50 meters in all steep areas. However, this law is not always followed, and many rivers in Costa Rica have less forest around them. In this study, we conducted a countrywide assessment of the impact of implementing the minimum provisions of the law, that is to say, 10-meter forest buffers, on ecosystem services in Costa Rica. To model changes in ecosystem services, first, we gathered data at a 10-meter spatial resolution for all of Costa Rica. We created a land cover map by combining data from the National Meteorological Institute, FRIAS, ICAFE, and the European Space Agency. We made two modeling scenarios. First, we made a baseline scenario using the current land cover. See the map on the left in this slide, where each pixel is 10 meters. Second, to create our reforestation scenario, we added 10 meters of secondary forest buffer on either side of all rivers in appropriate land cover classes. See the map on the right, where forest has been added on both sides of the river. We then ran ecosystem service models to examine how services changed between the baseline and reforestation scenarios. We did this using Invest, the open source software created by the Natural Capital project that performs spatially explicit ecosystem service modeling, which you just heard so much about from Jesse. We ran 4 different models, 1 for carbon sequestration and 3 related to water quality: sediment retention, nitrogen retention, and phosphorus retention. You just heard about many of these models from Jesse. Well, I suppose just sediment retention, but I'll share a little bit more about how they work, as well as the inputs we used to run them in Costa Rica. The sediment retention model, which you heard about from Jesse today and Rafa Schmidt yesterday, measures the capacity of a landscape to retain sediment and to stop soil from flowing into streams. It works by overlaying maps of land cover and information about how different land cover classes retain sediment with maps of erosivity related to precipitation, erodibility related to soil, and topography. We used our Costa Rican land cover map coupled with a biophysical table that listed a C factor value for each land cover class. We parameterized this table through literature review and used values taken from studies in Costa Rica wherever possible. We took our erosivity and erodibility values from a global study by Borelli et al. Finally, we used a 10-meter DEM, digital elevation model, that we created for Costa Rica for topography. The nutrient retention model is very similar to the sediment retention model, but it evaluates the capacity of a landscape to retain nutrients, specifically nitrogen and phosphorus, and stop them from flowing into a stream. The inputs of the nutrient model are a land cover map and a biophysical table, a precipitation raster, and topography. Once again, we used our Costa Rica land cover map and DEM, as well as an average precipitation layer that we derived through remote sensing. The biophysical table for the nutrient retention model contains information about how many nutrients each land cover type contributes to the landscape. For instance, an oil palm plantation might have a lot of nitrogen input from fertilizer, as well as how good each land cover type is at retaining nutrients. Once again, we parameterized this biophysical table using local data from Costa Rica wherever possible. Now I'd like to talk a little bit more about how the sediment and nutrient models work, which you did hear about from Jesse, but I think there are a couple important points that I just really wanted to make. Both the sediment and nutrient models from Invest use hydrological routing, which means taking into account how water flows through the landscape from higher to lower elevation into rivers. Using hydrological routing allows us to consider 2 impacts of vegetation. First, its ability to trap sediment that flows into it from upstream, and second, its ability to reduce erosion. To illustrate the first, consider vegetation in a single pixel in a landscape, shown here in orange. Water flows from the landscape upstream of it and carries sediment to the vegetation, which can then stop that sediment before it reaches a stream. That pixel of vegetation can also contribute less to erosion than other land cover would. The pixel itself releases less sediment than a pixel of bare ground would. The C factor in the sediment retention model tells us about both of these processes, and the nutrient retention model takes them into account as well. This also means that there are two ways to reduce sediment through land management. You can aim both to reduce erosion in individual areas and to capture sediment before it reaches a stream. It's often preferable to reduce erosion if you can, in order to keep fertile soil on the landscape. Some land management strategies, such as terracing a field, help with both aspects, while others, such as buffering around streams, which we discuss here, only capture sediment before it reaches a stream. The final model we ran was carbon sequestration. This is a relatively simple model that allows you to simply assign carbon values to different land cover classes, and then adds up the amount of each land cover class across each scenario to get total carbon stock. For this model, we divided Costa Rica up into IPCC carbon zones, and then used data from the IPCC to parameterize above ground carbon for each land cover and IPCC combination. I'll talk a little bit more about this and why we haven't used Costa Rica specific data later in the talk. So, to summarize, we ran 4 ecosystem services models for carbon sequestration, sediment retention, nitrogen retention, and phosphorus retention for all of Costa Rica for both a baseline and reforestation scenario. These models generated maps of the amount of ecosystem services in each 10-meter pixel in Costa Rica for each scenario. Now, I would like to share the results of these models. We found that using fine scale data allowed us to make very detailed predictions about how riparian reforestation could increase ecosystem services. As an example of this, I would like to show you what the output of one of these models looks like, so that you can see the level of detail and extent of the data. This is the output of the sediment retention model for the baseline scenario, so it's showing current levels of sediment retention across Costa Rica at a 10-meter resolution raster covering all of Costa Rica, where the pixel values are sediment retention in tons of sediment per pixel per year. Darker pixels mean pixels with greater sediment retention, which is a greater capacity to stop sediment from reaching streams. If we zoom in on this map of Costa Rica to specific areas, we can see the level of detail in these results. Here, I show 3 areas at a closer scale, along with satellite imagery to allow us to compare areas of high and low sediment retention with the underlying land cover. Note that the white lines running through these maps are streams. On the left, you can see the landscape around Liberia and Volcán Rincón de la Vieja. The areas of bare soil on the mountainside have low sediment retention values. They are showing up in lighter brown, while the forested areas are in darker brown. They are good at retaining sediment. On the top right, I show Alajuela and Volcán Boas. You can see that the bare volcano top itself has low sediment retention values, as do the steep slopes to the north of the city, while the forest has high values. On the bottom right, I show the countryside in Coto Bruce. Here, agricultural lands have lower retention values, while forest patches have higher values. If we zoom even further into one of these landscapes, we can examine the difference in retention between the baseline and reforestation scenarios. On the left, here, I show the baseline scenario, and on the right here, the reforestation scenario, where we have added 10 meters of secondary forest buffer on each side of the stream. And the stream, once again, is in white. You can see that adding forest to those pixels increases their sediment retention values. They are darker than the pixels on the left. We can then subtract the baseline from the reforestation scenario maps to generate maps of increase in retention with riparian reforestation. We can see that not only do the individual pixels around streams contribute less sediment to streams, they also stop sediment from areas upslope, especially pasture, as shown here, from flowing into the stream and lower the amount of sediment export from those pixels. So now I've shown you the raw outputs of one of our models and how you can relate them to actual data and look at the differences between scenarios. However, this information is so detailed that it can be hard to draw conclusions from. So instead, we often summarize the results of these models by larger geographic areas so that we can see patterns in changes in services. Next, I'd like to share summarized versions of our models, as well as the conclusions that we drew about the potential of riparian reforestation to increase ecosystem services in Costa Rica. First, we found that riparian buffers have the largest potential impact on ecosystem services in areas that are steep, prone to erosion, and have high levels of nutrient fertilization. In this first figure, we show the increases in all 3 hydrological services with riparian reforestation for each watershed in Costa Rica. Basically, we took the increase in service map that I showed for sediment retention and summed it up by watershed. Darker colors here indicate bigger increases in services, and all results have been normalized by watershed area. In A, in green, we show the amount of forest added to each watershed. More forest has been added in watersheds with more extensive river networks that were previously unforested. In B, C, and D, we show increases in sediment, nitrogen, and phosphorus retention that resulted from adding that forest. We can see that services do not increase directly in proportion to the amount of forest added. Instead, sediment retention increases most in steep erosion-prone watersheds, while barely changing in the flat northwest or forested southeast of Costa Rica. Nitrogen and phosphorus export decreased most in the urban area around San Jose, where nutrient retention is low, and in agriculture-dominated watersheds with high levels of fertilization. We can also summarize our countrywide results by other groupings. For example, in this table, I am showing the increases in sediment, nitrogen, and phosphorus retention from riparian reforestation for several coffee-growing cantones. Once again, I have normalized the results by the area of the canton. We can also look at increases in ecosystem services at a much smaller spatial scale, as I showed before. Here, I am showing increases in all 4 ecosystem services: carbon sequestration in green, sediment retention in brown, nitrogen retention in red, and phosphorus retention in purple. I show all of these in a single watershed, the one that contains El Río Pacuar, El Río Pedrego, y El Río Quebradas. These detailed maps at a 10-meter resolution can show us where riparian reforestation is the most impactful. While increases in carbon stock occur everywhere that forest buffer is added along rivers, sediment retention decreases when reforestation takes place downstream of land cover prone to erosion, such as pasture or agriculture. Similarly, nitrogen and phosphorus retention increase in areas with high levels of fertilization or low capacities to retain nutrients, including agriculture, pasture, and urban areas. By summarizing our results across the entire country, we show that a small increase in forest cover from riparian reforestation in Costa Rica could lead to large increases in ecosystem services. By reforesting all rivers with 10 meters of forest, a total increase of 526 kilometers squared, we could potentially increase carbon stock by almost 8 million megagrams, sediment retention by almost 1 million tons per year, nitrogen retention by almost 2 million tons per year, and phosphorus retention by 230,000 kilograms per year. In other words, by increasing forest cover by 1.9%, we could increase ecosystem carbon stock and sediment, nitrogen, and phosphorus retention by 1.6, 5, 10.8, and 12.9%. To summarize, these models have showed us that riparian reforestation generates high return on investment. A 2% increase in nationwide forest cover around rivers could increase ecosystem services by up to 13% over current levels. We have also seen that buffers are most effective in sites that are steep, prone to erosion, and have high nutrient fertilization. Now that I've shared a little bit about how we ran our models and showed the power of scenario-based ecosystem services modeling to policy-relevant outcomes, I'd like to dive into a little bit more technical detail about the challenges we faced over the course of this modeling. Some of the problems we faced are common in ecosystem services modeling, while others were specific to our circumstances, where we were trying to run models using very fine-scale data. Regardless, I'd like to share them because I think that the problems we work through may be ones you face as well, doing similar spatial analysis work. And I hope that some of the solutions we came up with might be helpful. The three major challenges we faced were creating scenarios using very fine-scale spatial data, matching land cover data with hydrological data, and choosing between local and global data. First, I'd like to talk about the challenges of running InVEST ecosystem services models with very fine-scale spatial data. Because we were trying to build a reforestation scenario that matched the Forest Law 7575 with 10-meter forest buffers on each side of a river, we needed to have land cover data at a 10-meter resolution. However, InVEST models generally take data inputs with a much larger spatial resolution. For example, the global erodibility layer we used was at a resolution of 1 kilometer. A resolution of that size is much more standard as a model input. Using finer scale data introduces a number of computational challenges with data storage and also with the amount of time it takes to run the models. Because we required such fine-scale data, we also had to generate our own land cover map. We created a hybrid product that combined data from different sources to try to get the most specific, up-to-date land cover data possible. We began with a map from the National Meteorological Institute from 2012, rasterized to 10 meters. We filled in missing data with a forest cover raster we generated and land cover from the European Space Agency from 2012. We then added data on pasture, oil palm, and pineapple cover from Trias in 2019, and coffee cover from Icafe in 2012. Finally, we added rivers that we generated from our DEM. I'll talk more about that in a minute. By doing this, we ended up with a land cover map of Costa Rica with no missing data, 38 land cover classes, and at a 10-meter resolution. We wanted to use this map to generate a policy-relevant reforestation scenario that matched the provisions of the Ley Forestal 7575. We consulted with collaborators in Trias to determine which land cover classes it made sense to reforest and which it didn't. For example, coffee around rivers should be replaced with forest, while natural vegetation around rivers should not be. We then added 10 meters of secondary forest buffer on both sides of rivers in only the appropriate land cover classes to create our reforestation scenario that matched Costa Rican law. For example, you can
Uh-oh, did we lose Kelly? Or is it just me?
I lost Kelly.
Oh dear.
Yes.
Yeah, she's frozen.
Okay. Do we want to give it a second, or should we have Jeff sub in? Oh, she's off. Maybe she'll come back.
Probablemente.
Nope, she's back. Yay, you're back.
Did I disappear?
You did.
Oh dear, I'm sorry, everybody.
Just for the last 30 seconds. Not
Okay.
bad.
Okay, well, I will just start again and hope it doesn't happen again.
Okay, if it does, we can bring in the reserve guard.
Okay, that sounds great. What was I on before I disappeared?
Yes, you were on this slide.
Was I had I started talking about this scenario?
Yeah, just barely.
Okay, I will just start again.
Start
Apologies
over,
if
yeah.
I repeat myself. And if not, Jeff will become me and present for me. Thank you, everybody, for your patience. Okay, I think where I left off, I said you can see in this scenario in the upper left that forest buffer has replaced urban, pasture, and agricultural land cover around rivers. However, in the upper right, forest cover has not replaced mixed use areas, which are a mix of natural vegetation and human land uses. And in this scenario picture in the bottom, forest has not replaced natural vegetation. This type of fine-scale scenario modeling is very powerful and also allows us to model other specific relevant scenarios. For example, here on the right, I show what it would look like to add 50 meters of forest buffer around rivers, which is the maximum provision of the Ley Forestal 7575. I can run these scenarios through my models as well and see how different policy-relevant changes in the landscape could affect ecosystem services nationwide. So now I've talked about the challenges of modeling fine-scale scenarios, as well as how powerful they can be for modeling policy interventions. The second challenge we faced was matching land cover data with hydrological data. As I mentioned earlier in my talk, our hydrological models use hydrological routing to understand how sediment flows through a watershed. Hydrological routing uses a DEM to show how a drop of water will flow, following the steepest path through a landscape. This is very different from our land cover maps. However, our models overlay topographic and land cover data, and that means both of them must have the same resolution and show rivers in the same places. Because our land cover had to be at a 10-meter scale to make our scenarios, our DEM also had to be at 10 meters. This introduced several problems to matching our DEM to our land cover. First, DEMs can be inaccurate and have artifacts that throw off routing. Second, DEMs can have cartographic problems or mismatches in projection that matter a lot at a 10-meter scale. And third, rivers can change locations over time, so mapping them in land cover is rarely 100% accurate. All of these mean that it's very difficult to match land cover to a DEM, and this difficulty is amplified the finer scale your data is, where an offset of 20 meters is suddenly several pixels. We saw this reflected in our data. Our rivers in our original land cover map didn't match where rivers were according to our DEM. We can derive rivers from DEMs through hydrological routing and calculating where water is flowing to. Up at the top, you can see in light blue rivers in the original land cover map, And in this middle picture, you can see the same rivers in dark blue that we derived from the DEM. And on bottom, you can see that there's a mismatch between the two. This mismatch is particularly problematic when we are interested in measuring the effect of adding buffers around rivers. We need to use our land cover map to create our scenarios and define where our buffers are. Therefore, we need our DEM to match our land cover map. If the DEM doesn't match with the land cover map, there can be two consequences as water and sediment flows downslope to a stream. In the first case, a grain of sediment can reach a buffered stream from the land cover map that is not a hydrological stream. Because of the way our models work, the sediment will stop there and never get counted as exported. Therefore, sediment export will be underestimated. We will also not see an effect of riparian buffers in stopping sediment from reaching a stream, since it won't matter whether the land cover stream was buffered or not. In the second case, a grain of sediment will meet an unbuffered hydrological stream. That sediment will be counted as exported, but since the stream isn't buffered, our models won't show us any benefit of riparian buffers. We were faced with this problem. Our DEM needed to match our land cover map so that they both said that streams were in the same place in order for our models to correctly report sediment export and to measure the impact of riparian buffers. However, they did not match each other. We decided to deal with this issue by getting rid of all water from the original map and then adding rivers from the DEM. Specifically, we filled in water classes from our original land cover map, treating them like missing data. We then delineated streams from the DEM using the route DEM algorithm so that we got a layer of streams based on our DEM. Finally, we added this layer of streams back onto our land cover map as a new water class so that all water on the land cover map matched where water was supposed to be according to the DEM. So now I've talked extensively about the challenges of matching land cover data and hydrological data for hydrological models, and how it is especially important when you are modeling the effects of land cover change directly adjacent to rivers. In this last section of my talk, I'd like to briefly touch on a final challenge we faced: the decision of when to use global data and when to use local data in our models. One of the major global versus local data decisions we made was about our DEM. As you will recall, we used our DEM to predict where streams were in the landscape. So we wanted to make sure that our DEM was predicting streams as accurately as possible. We tested both a global hydrosheds DEM that we downsampled to 10 meters and a local DEM from the Digital Atlas of Costa Rica and compared them to a map of rivers that we got from SNIT. On the left, you can see the rivers derived from the global DEM in light blue compared to the rivers from SNIT in dark blue. And on the right, rivers derived from the local DEM in purple compared to SNIT again in dark blue. As you can see from these pictures, we found that the global DEM generally did a better job of predicting where rivers were, so we decided to use it instead of the local DEM. The second decision about using global versus local data was for parameterizing our carbon model. The carbon model requires a biophysical table with estimates of above ground carbon for each land use class, and we decided to make estimates for each land use class and IPCC carbon zone combination. Costa Rica has an amazing forest inventory, and we initially planned to use above ground carbon values from forest inventory plots to estimate forest carbon for our models, along with global values from the IPCC for non-forest land use classes. However, when we compared forest values from the IPCC to forest values from the forest inventory, we found that they were quite different. In general, we found that the above ground carbon values from the IPCC were a lot higher than the average values for forest plots of each specific forest type in each carbon zone. And these IPCC values often fell outside the range of observed values in forest plots. This is an issue when we are using forest plot data in combination with IPCC values to estimate carbon for non-forest land use classes, because then we're estimating carbon for those classes to be higher than forest classes. For example, in Bosque Seco Tropical, IPCC estimates Charal y Tacotal to have an above-ground carbon stock value of 53 megagrams per hectare, which is higher than the average value derived from the forest plots in the same region. Suddenly, we're predicting that non-forest land classes have higher carbon than forest land classes. Because of this, we ended up deciding just to use global IPCC data for now, despite the existence of good local data. However, although I tried my best to obtain and interpret data from the forest plots, it's quite possible that I misunderstood aspects of the inventory. So if there are experts in this audience who are very familiar with this data and these results look strange to you, I would love to talk more about it. Okay, we've now reached the end of my presentation. I've shared with you how I ran Invest ecosystem service models, shared interpretations of our results, and how we use them to gain policy relevant information about changes in ecosystem services, and shared some of the technical challenges we faced in the process. I'd like to leave you again with these conclusions, both from our scenarios and from doing ecosystem services modeling as a general process. First, repair and reforestation generates a high return on investment. The 2% increase in nationwide forest cover could increase ecosystem services by up to 13% over current levels. And once again, I'll say that we found that buffers are most effective in sites that are steep, prone to erosion, and have high nutrient fertilization. Finally, we concluded that fine-scale ecosystem service modeling is challenging, but can pinpoint priorities for policy interventions. Thank you so much for listening. Please feel free to get in touch with me to discuss this project more, either through my email or through Twitter. With that, I would like to thank my amazing collaborators in Costa Rica and at Stanford and open up the discussion for questions. And I will stop sharing my screen now.
Thank you, Kelly.
Thanks, Becky.
So yeah, let's have just a few minutes of free Q&A time before we go into the last section. You were doing such a good job of fielding questions last time, Kelly, but now you're going to be answering them. So
I know, now I'm trying to catch up with everything.
Maybe would Jeff or Ale want to, have you guys been reading the questions? Do you have any ideas for ones you want to pose?
I think Ali's been following the questions more closely than I have been.
Muy bien, sí, tenemos de hecho varios comentarios.
Very well, we have many questions, many comments from Herbert Villavicencio, and I'm going to mention the first question. It says, which was the vector layer for watersheds that was used to run the model? And what resolution did you use for that layer? Is it available as a geoservice?
Yeah, I can answer that question. So actually, the layer of watersheds that we used to run our model was one that we derived ourselves from our DEM. And I don't think we've currently shared it on Cinia, but we could make it available. As for the resolution, I'm not quite sure how to answer that question because it's a shapefile input and not a raster input. Perhaps Rafa Schmidt would like to say more about that.
Yeah, so basically the watershed output, or let's say the watershed shapefiles can be really used in a very flexible way to basically tailor the analysis based to your specific needs. And they don't need to be necessarily derived from the digital elevation model. So for example, if you have a specific point of interest, let's say you have an intake of an hydropower project and you want to understand how much sediment comes from the upstream area under different scenarios, then you have a shapefile of the contributing area, then you could just add that shapefile to the model without the need to delineating it from the digital elevation model. So in the end, these like watersheds really allow us to tailor the analysis of the results, but they are not themselves part of the analysis.
Y bueno, veo que hay más preguntas o más comentarios de Herbert, pero
There are more questions from Herbert, but we can ask him afterwards. We can email him. Okay, so Herbert will email you all of the answers to your questions. We have another question from Ivan Cruz for the entire team, I think. Have you considered or have you taken any measures in biological corridors?
That is a fantastic question. And actually, when we first conceived this study, it was really because we were interested in thinking about biological corridors in particular and how reforesting rivers could help to improve biological corridors and habitat connectivity for biodiversity. So far, we haven't done a lot of work on that. We've only done this ecosystem services work related to biological corridors, but I would be happy to talk more about the possibilities there or learn more about any work that you have done related to biological corridors, because I think there is a huge potential for this kind of restoration to improve outcomes for biodiversity as well. And of course, we all care about biodiversity as well as ecosystem services. Were there
por
any
ahora
more
no tenemos
questions?
más preguntas abiertas.
We
Así
have
que
no more open questions, so we're going to ask the general audience to just continue to jot down your questions. We have some positive comments for Kelly. They said, excellent job, Kelly. It's very important what you're doing, or what you're doing is very important for political decision makers.
That is fantastic. That was the hope, so that I hope it can be useful for many people.
I was just wondering if we wanted to maybe invite I'm looking for the Fermin. Maybe we could unmute Fermin if they would like to say anything about the ISE data and interest in sediment modeling particularly. No pressure, but if you want, I'm going to allow you to talk, Fermin, if you would like to provide any detail on what you shared in the chat or the Q&A. I forget where it was. I think maybe, unfortunately, our discussion. Oh, is it working? He's unmuted. Hola? Oh, I'm sorry. It's because there's translation happening.
It's okay.
Yeah, los escucho. No.
Yes, he can hear you. You can ask the question again, perhaps.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Sorry, I thought you were sorry.
No.
I just was hoping maybe you could raise what you already wrote in the chat or in the Q&A box about the data that ISE has. That we already used ISE data in our validation that we shared yesterday that Rafa showed. But it sounds like you were sharing additional data that you have, and just if there's any additional interest you'd like to raise about the sediment retention model from ISE's point of view.
El día de ayer no pude estar en el taller. Hasta ahora.
I didn't attend yesterday, and I just like walked in today because my ISE colleague told me that there was a workshop on this area, on this topic. Well, I do work in ISE socio-environmental department. We are now working on assessing a watershed management plan at the higher elevations of the Reventazón River. We're working on an erosion model with Invest. And reviewing my bibliography, I found this SDR model. I didn't know it until it's just recently that I found out. So I went ahead and downloaded it. And I was also looking at the swap model. But I really liked in the Invest model. Because it deals with sediment export and to the different watersheds or the different streams at the Reventazón River basin. We have 2 basins, so we want to know how much sediment reaches these basins per year. And I'm working with the input data at 10 to 10,000 scale. I have all the data for the erosion factor with coverage, with erodibility, erosivity, modeling, and biophysical data. So I just finished using Invest, and it says that everything was completed successfully. So I'm going to go review the results to see how I did. But that's theoretical erosion, right? I'd like to perhaps try to get more information as to real time erosion with observed field data, with data hydrological stations, hydroelectric power stations, sorry. You probably know this area. They have the suspended sediment data. They have a registry that goes back many years. So they've logged that. So I guess I would use that data to do the sensitivity analysis. But I know that's kind of complex. And that's kind of what I want to learn how to do better or learn about. Thank you.
That's fantastic. And it sounds like we should have a follow-up call because I think we would love to share the results of our model run with you. And sorry to, it's no problem. We can send you slides from yesterday. But we would love to share those results with you and hear about what you found. And Rafa, do you have any thoughts you'd like to contribute to?
Yeah, thank you, Fermin, for this question or for this input. That's really excellent that you're running Invest because we think that hydropower is actually one of the greatest beneficiaries of better upstream sediment management. So great to see that you're interested. And as Becky mentioned, we can share the slides from yesterday where we show how we used some of the ISE data about sediment to better understand how well our models represent reality. And I would also make one little comment in general about how much the invest models for water, for sediment, for nutrients represent reality, or how much, as Herman said, they are like theoretical or hypothetical. In general, if we don't have any data to compare model results to, it's very hard to make any statement about the accuracy and to really like evaluate if, let's say, our model predicts 10 million tons of outcome, if that is correct and realistic or not. It's very hard to say that in general. You need really data to understand the quality of the model. However, what we are pretty confident in general is the spatial pattern. So basically, even if we can't be confident that the real sediment export is, say, 10 million tons, we can still analyze the model results in a sense that we can look at different sub-watersheds and understand which sub-watershed provide more or less sediment. Again, the total values might be off without calibration, but we think we can trust the relative values, and we can then also use this understanding of relative values, for example, to collect more data. If we know that one watershed provides most of the sediment, largest fraction of the sediment, we could, for example, targeted monitoring for that watershed. So I think even, let's say, even if you don't have any data for calibration of the model, don't be deterred or don't think that you can't use the models at all. We think you can still get useful information, and I think we have some examples for that in our knowledge portal and in some of the papers that were developed using the SDR model, for example.
Thank you, Rafa.
Okay, muchas gracias.
Oh, thanks so much for that information.
Okay, I think we're going to transition to our last section, which will be briefer than the first two. We have about 15 minutes left. I recognize that maybe you guys could use a break, but we only have 15 minutes left. So do you think you can hang in there 15 more minutes? Is that okay? You can send me reactions down at the bottom. But I think, yes, I think I will just share a little bit about the data products and where you can find them. And then we can have a brief discussion on what you'd like to see more of in the future. So let me share.
Sorry, Becky.
Yes.
If we could break 5 minutes, I would really appreciate it.
Oh, okay, of course.
Would you mind at all? I mean, would it be a problem?
Of course, that's fine.
Or maybe 3 minutes, 3 minutes, 3 minutes.
3 minutes, that's great.
3
yeah.
minutes, okay. Just
Thank
give me
you for
3 minutes.
speaking up.
Okay.
I'm
Okay.
sorry.
Sorry about that. No, it's okay.
No, I'm sorry.
If you could announce it so I could translate it. Okay.
Okay. 3 minutes bio break. Hello and welcome back just for the last few moments of our presentations here. I'm going to share a little bit about some of the products that you heard about today and yesterday and try to help clear up any confusion that you may have about what the relationship is between these two different sets of talks you heard. Yesterday being more about modeling advances, and today being more about Invest that is currently available and that you can download yourself. So this is the two pieces that we were talking about. Invest today, this is the modeling software that you can download, is free and open source and user-friendly. And then what we were talking about yesterday, we're calling Invest Plus, which is models in development. So we do have code that you could use to run these. If you were interested, please get in touch because we would love to have additional collaborators on this, but these are not yet released in our software. We do hope they will be within the year. So Invest, again, is this suite of models that Jesse presented on. And Invest Plus is what you heard about yesterday. So this is the schematic from yesterday where we were describing how Earth observations, these satellite data, are replacing what otherwise would be a land use, land cover map that Jesse talked about quite a bit. So I wanted to just touch briefly on how this project originated was through a grant from NASA and their GEO program, the Group on Earth Observations. And the Group on Earth Observations Biodiversity Observation Network, GEOBON, has developed this framework for essential biodiversity variables, which are split into species-focused classes and ecosystem-focused classes. So I apologize for the terminology here not being Spanish, but I do want you to recognize EBV is an internationally recognized acronym now. So I didn't translate the acronym, but we're talking about species EBVs and ecosystem EBVs. The species EBVs could be in terms of genetic composition, species populations, or species traits. And the ecosystem EBVs are community composition, ecosystem structure, and ecosystem function. And we use all of these in our modeling. Well, not genetic composition, but otherwise we're really trying to show the relationships between biodiversity and ecosystem services by connecting some of these essential variables for species and for ecosystems to the ecosystem services supply. And then when we combine that with information on demand, we get a new model for ecosystem services that is an EBV ecosystem service. So if we go back to this schematic, I wanted to step through in just a little more detail than yesterday to show you how this plays out for each service. That for pollinators, we're using both ecosystem EBVs and species level EBVs in two different ways that Jeff presented yesterday. We have the functional diversity of the habitat from EVI, a vegetation index, that tells us about habitat for pollinators. And then we have species distribution models that create maps of abundance and diversity of pollinators, that when we combine those two, we get the abundance of pollinators on a point of interest, like a farm that needs pollination, which is coming from the demand side. And those two combined is what gives us our ecosystem service pollination of crops. Now, what Jesse presented was basically that this entire area is just parameterized based on land use, land cover. And that is difficult to do. It's difficult to know how good the habitat is for pollinators and how many pollinators are likely to be present. So this is, and please someone interrupt me if I need to pay attention to the chat. One of the other panelists, let me know if I need to change anything. For tourism, in this case, we think more about the pathway through species. So the fractional cover information from satellites combined with climatic and elevation information go into our species distribution models for abundance and diversity. And in this case, we're thinking more about the diversity of birds and other vertebrates that drive visitation to particular places by ecotourists. And in this case, we need to also understand on the demand side, roads and hotels and other amenities, other infrastructure to get us to this service of ecotourism. And in this case, again, we use non-Earth observation data like social network data from eBird in order to create the model. And then finally, for water purification or water quality regulation, in this case, we only go through the ecosystem pathway. So we, again, use the vegetation index to get a sense of the ecosystem structure and function that will then tell us about the cover factor, the C factor that Jesse presented on, which in combination with precipitation and slope and measurements of soil get us to that supply of erosion control. In the example that Jesse gave, this was replaced by land use, land cover, and there's just a single C factor for every land use type, when actually there's quite a lot of heterogeneity of productivity or cover within the same land cover type. So we get a lot more heterogeneity when we use the the vegetation index. So the use of these EBVs in modeling ecosystem services means that we have these EBVs themselves, like bird species richness, ecosystem functional type, tree cover, and fractional cover that feed into these products for ecosystem services, like tourism that's based on biodiversity, pollinator abundance, and sediment export. And all of these are available right now on CINEA. The website is right here. And so we have data sets for Invest Plus, as well as data sets for Invest from the work that Kelly has done, which include all of those great inputs that might be useful for other purposes in addition to ecosystem services that we will share. And so the last thing that we're hoping for input on is which of these you think you're most interested in using. We can prioritize trying to pull those together so that they're more discoverable, because right now the website just is a big long list of all of these different data sets. And if you wanted to know what are all the data sets I need to run the sediment retention model, for instance, it might be a little hard to find. So if that's a service of high interest, we can prioritize creating a document that will link you to all of those data, for instance. So I'll stop there. We had hoped for a little more of a discussion, but I think I wouldn't have changed anything about the good conversations we've already had. So maybe what we can do is there is a post event survey that if you want to fill out, you can tell us both what from this you would most like more information on, as well as what you might be interested in learning more about if we were to hold an invest training, a hands-on training later in the spring next year. So it's hard to know what to do with the last 2 minutes, but Rafa, maybe you want to close us out here.
No, muchas gracias. De hecho que voy para usar esto.
Y estoy en español. Sí, excelente. Más bien es como una avalancha.
Excellent. No, it's an avalanche of information that we've gotten today that we need to digest. But I'd like to be able to process this information, make it more accessible to you. So one is development, capacity development. So we're going to definitely hold more of these types of activities in the future. So the more feedback we get, the better direction will, or the better the path will follow. Also, how to make this more accessible. We have the Cinia platform that already has some data. So we even have to think about getting this information out to users and understand priority needs. To be able to tell you at Stanford, okay, let's do this, let's do that, let's tweak that. This is more important for me for that reason. So that's why it's important to get the involvement of people that want to work with us here in Costa Rica. Many people are supporting this. So we would like to reply to your great contribution appropriately, so you can leverage on this project and comply and fulfill your objectives. So that's just kind of my own summary. Rafa's own summary.
That's great. Thank you, Rafa. And for that post-event survey, we would love to hear from you. As soon as you close your window, a pop-up will come up and ask you to fill out this survey. There is a question on please identify the 2 things you found most useful from this workshop. Let's say that question is about what products or what information would you most like us to prioritize, getting out more accessibly to you. And then there's a lot of other questions about what you might like to do in the future for a future invest training. So that capacity building point that Rafa made. So I hope we will hear from all of you in the survey, and please feel free. You'll be hearing from us after the event. We'll send out an email with recordings, links to recordings, and all of the question and answers, which anything that we didn't get to today live, we will write out answers to and share with you all to keep this conversation going. And if you have any other questions after that, please just feel free to reply to that email, get in touch, and we can be collaborating. I wish we were in person because I would like to see all your faces and say thank you for being here. But thank you for being here.
Thank you, everyone. Gracias a todos y todas.
Gracias por su participación. Nos vemos la próxima.
Thanks so much for your participation. See you next time. Take care.
Gracias, chao.
Gracias.